You and I pretty soon we'll be
Hi, how's it going, guys? I hope you've all been well this entire week, months, this entire year. To begin with, we are going to do an expert panel today with a few folks that are incredibly knowledgeable about human immunology, about molecular biology, and overall are here to share with you information that's going to help you better understand COVID-19, the vaccine, ideas, and different topics like herd immunity, and overall just anything that you might be wanting to ask going into this year with so much developing and so much changing. I mean, you're hearing in the news about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine. You're also hearing about variants of all kinds appearing in places like England and New York. And so much of this information is, to say the least, incredibly difficult to digest. But I, have met some wonderful folks who are willing to share this information with you guys, willing to answer your questions, and willing to answer frequently asked questions about the vaccine, how it was developed, if it's safe or not, if you should take it, and if you shouldn't take it, depending on who you are, where you're at, and what your life is like. But without further ado, I really don't want to spend too much time just talking on my own. I'd love to introduce both of our guests today, Dale Harrison and Jack Verdman, who both have extensive experience. We're going to start by asking them a little bit about their background. They're going to tell you what they know and why they have the authority that they do have to speak on topics like the vaccine and the COVID virus. So, Dale, could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your experience with COVID-19 and maybe your credentials?
Sure. So I originally started out in experimental physics. Sorry about that. I had a glitch here. No,
No worries.
no. I originally started out in experimental physics a few careers ago, and ended up jumping into the biotech industry mid-career. Um, Initially in the area of robotic design work for DNA and protein synthesizers, but have gone on to run biotech companies. I've run genetic sequencing labs. And in the last several years, I've mostly focused in molecular diagnostics, so working with companies that are in the molecular diagnostic space. And a lot of this, some of this is PCR, but a lot of this is in the sequencing realm and around CRISPR diagnostics as well. So I've worked with companies like Arc Biosystems, which has, Arc Bio, which is out of Cambridge, that has a next generation sequencing platform for viral detection for transplant patients. And I'm currently doing work with Mammoth Biosciences out in San Francisco that's developing a CRISPR-based diagnostic platform.
That's awesome. And in regards to COVID, what do you feel like you're more experienced with? Do you have any experience with COVID since the pandemic? Have you been involved in any like research and development specific to the virus?
Yeah, I mean, most of what I've been working on has been in some way driven by COVID, because much of the biotech industry, and especially the molecular diagnostic side, has really pivoted in the last year to being, very heavily focused on COVID. Obviously, coming up with newer, better tests, essentially, and coming up with ways to expand testing capacity to be able to manage, what is now, literally millions of tests being run continuously.
Yeah. That's so awesome, Dale. I really appreciate you being here with us. I think that there's a lot of misinformation, regarding testing and regarding the vaccine in general. And I mean, you threw in so many terms that even I'm unfamiliar with, but I look forward to unraveling some of that. And Jack, you've been here before. Could you, remind us, what your experience is and what you're here for today?
Sure. Yeah, I am a molecular biologist. My research, I'll be perfectly candid, I've not researched COVID-19. My background, though, is in vaccine development, understanding the manufacturing process, understanding what happens on a cellular and molecular level. I researched pandemic flu viruses and inducing long-term vaccine-induced immunity to them for several years. And since we last spoke, I've actually started additional degree programs to get degrees in healthcare law and
regarding testing and regarding the vaccine in general.
Feedback. An additional degree program to get a law degree in healthcare law and a master's degree in healthcare policy.
That's a jack of all trades. It's so cool, doing law and then, having that experience in molecular biology. I really appreciate both of you being on here today. And I'm seeing, in the comments that somebody is really concerned that, we're here to push vaccines. And I think that's really, inaccurate, or it's a mischaracterization of what we're doing today with Jack and Dale. Jack and Dale are here specifically to answer your questions, right? So if you're watching this and you're thinking, I don't trust the vaccine, or I don't like, all the propaganda, or you're thinking that, a lot of what's been going on recently has been like with the end of trying to control your life and tell you what to do. This is not it. This is the complete opposite. Dale and Jack are here to answer your questions from an expert professional standpoint about the many different rumors or the many different, topics related to COVID-19. It's an incredibly complicated issue. And I understand why many of you guys feel like, every time you hear or you see somebody speak about, vaccinations, they're only trying to manipulate you into thinking a particular way. But this is your chance to grill these two people, give them a run for their money. I'm sure that they'll be happy to answer your questions. And if, obviously they can't, we'll find a way to get an answer to any questions that you might have about COVID, because obviously none of us know all the answers, but I'm sure that, between all of us, we could eventually figure it out. So, let's, maybe start with this first question here on the screen. I'm going to allow this, but then I'm also going to ask some questions of my own that I put together for these folks. But there are some people that are curious about how effective Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are against different variants. So Jack, I think that was a question I wanted to ask you specifically. If you want to, kind of get the ball going with that.
Yeah, it's kind of coming out like gangbusters. The answer to your question, unfortunately, is that we don't really have enough information to answer that conclusively yet. So there's a process that needs to take place when evaluating how effective vaccines are in fending off variations of a virus. A situation similar to this that we do have much more information about would be influenza, where there are thousands of strains and they're constantly sort of mutating and changing, and the flu shot gets reformulated every year. What we do know from that particular milieu is that when you do get a flu shot, right, and you are exposed to a flu virus that wasn't in your original flu shot, am I being clear so far? Those patients tend to get sick for shorter periods of time and to a lesser degree. So they may not necessarily prevent you from the morbidity, which is the word we use to describe actually feeling sick and having symptoms. It may not prevent that entirely, but yeah, the existing evidence in the field would suggest that at the very least, it would minimize what those symptoms are and how long they last.
Yeah. And Dale, do you have anything to add to that? Anything that Jack might have not mentioned so far?
Um, just what I've seen following the recent literature is that it seems like certainly the UK variant, which is the one that we have to worry about the most in the short term. The vaccines seem to be relatively effective. The P1 variant out of Brazil is, which we probably gonna have to worry about come the fall or winter, is more of an issue. But again, there is some level of protection. The question is how much. And right now, from what I've seen, there's sort of, and Jack can probably weigh in as well. There's sort of two lines of work here, and the results are somewhat contradictory. There are the in vitro studies, where you're essentially taking antibodies from a human and seeing how well they bind to specific proteins, literally in a petri dish, versus the epidemiological studies in especially South Africa and Brazil, which are showing much less effectiveness for the vaccine. So, it's not clear which of these tells the complete story. And again, I mean, this is something that Jack probably knows a great deal more about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dale. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that. So, I see that, obviously, like with COVID-19, like a lot of information is, coming, to us quickly. And not only quickly, but a lot of information is information that, is relatively new. And so I really appreciate, the fact that you're honest, right? That there's not necessarily a very clear, concrete idea of like, we know exactly the way that this vaccine is going to work with each and every variant. But I want to rope it back a little bit. And I want to kind of start with some of the more basic questions that people might have about COVID. I want to take it way back to, where people were having a lot of concerns about testing, so the first I think, kind of question that came to many people's minds when we first ever heard about COVID and this pandemic being concerning was how many people are actually getting sick, and is there a reliable way for us to know that there are actually people getting sick from COVID-19, right? Really early on, there was a lot of concerns about testing. There was a lot of concerns about, the numbers that were being reported about COVID-19. I think today, the USA Today has put out that we have over 29 million confirmed corona cases and upwards of 532 deaths. And Dale, I know you have some experience in, a little bit in the testing side of the COVID-19 virus. What do you have to say about the tests? What do you know about their accuracy? Are the numbers being reported accurate? Could you calm some of people's concerns here?
So there's a couple of things there. One is that I think from the very beginning, there was an intense effort on the part of people from certain political persuasions to deny that this existed, that the virus was fake, that nobody was getting sick, that nobody was dying. And to be honest, it persists to this day. There is a there's a lot of this just conspiracy nonsense out there. And, a lot of what these people have done is essentially just make up shit and push it out there. And, and it ends up getting picked up and amplified through, certain parts of the media. So the reality is that, in testing, the gold standard is a laboratory run PCR test. This is where you go into a clinic. They do what's called a nasopharyngeal swab, which is the 2-foot long Q-tip that they stick down your nose. They're actually sampling from the upper back of the throat. And then that gets sent off to a lab, and you get your results back in 3 to 5 days. So those tests are extraordinarily good. And how do you define good? Well, you define good by what can go wrong when you do a test. So there's two things that can go wrong. Either the test comes back positive when you really don't have the condition that they're testing for. So that's called a false positive. Or you actually do have the condition and it comes back negative. That's a false negative. So the deal with PCR test is there are essentially 0 false positives. If this test comes back positive, the false positive rate is on the order of 1 in several 100,000 tests, and it's actually not the test. It's almost always either a sample labeling error, or it's an error on the robotics where they're running large number of samples at once, and so there have been cases of like cross splash where samples will splash to an adjacent well. Those are extraordinarily rare. We're talking, on stuff like that on the order of 1 in millions. On the sample mislabeling where they put the wrong label on the tube at some point, or they key punch the wrong thing in, that's on the order of 1 in a few 100,000. So basically, if you get a positive, you absolutely have, within the last few days, you've had replicating virus in your throat or in your nose. You can take that to the bank. Now, the problem is that these tests tend to run a higher false negative. So the laboratory run PCR, in real world conditions, they're operating at probably about a 20% false negative. So it means that there's a lot of people that go in with COVID that get tested and they'll come back with a negative test. And, of course, the danger there is that they then, continue to engage in activities where they'll spread it. Now, the other thing about testing is that there are different kinds of tests. So you've got the PCR test. You have what's called a LAMP test. And people usually refer to these as rapid tests. So this is where you can go in and get your answer in 15 minutes or 20 minutes. You have what I call antigen test, which are even faster. They're a 5 or 10 minute test. And then you have the antibody test, which is usually a blood draw or a pinprick. So the antibody test is looking for antibodies, which means, were you sick 2 weeks ago? Because it'll take usually about 2 weeks after onset of symptoms before you're going to be able to reliably measure antibodies. But the other three, the antigen, the rapid test, and the PCR test, are looking for replicating virus. And but the problem with these is there's no free lunch with testing. The faster your results, the higher the false negative. So the antigen tests, these really, you're starting to see these as home tests, and they usually come with a little strip, like a little pregnancy test. These things can typically run 50% false negative. But the deal is, because they're very insensitive tests, if you do get a positive, you're a dead solid positive. If you've got people with a very high viral load, these things will absolutely show up positive. But they can miss a lot of people. The rapid tests are somewhere in between. They're 30 or 40% false negative. And again, if you rely solely on that test, you're going to get in trouble. And we saw this repeatedly in the White House last year, because the White House, they wouldn't use masks. They didn't do distancing. They didn't do quarantining. All they did was the Abbott ID Now rapid test. And the problem was that the false negatives were high enough that when you had large events, you were going to have somebody slip through, and eventually you're going to end up with a super spreader event, and they would have them, they had them repeatedly. And so, so that's the danger there with the different types of tests. But the deal is, if you get a positive, you can take it to the bank. You have virus. Now, it doesn't mean you have disease. And that's the other thing, is that not everyone who gets infected develops disease, meaning symptomatic disease. And not everyone that gets infected is going to be infectious to others. But we know that there are completely asymptomatic people who are highly infectious to others.
Yeah.
So you can't rely on, things like another area that there's been a lot of nonsense for months now in the news is this idea of cycle count. And the deal is, you cannot infer infectiousness from cycle count. There's just no data to support that. So cycle count basically is a measure of how much amplification you have to do of the sample to get a signal. And so there's this whole conspiracy theory that we should lower the cycle count on the test so that we get fewer positives. Well, the deal is, all those positives are real positives. and that just because you have a lower cycle count, one example is, people are typically, the cycle counts are typically set at around 40 for most of these tests, meaning you do 40 doublings of your original sample to get enough material for your detector to see it. And so the big argument has been, well, we have to lower the cycle count to 32, which is one of the numbers people have thrown out. Well, it turns out that a third of everyone who's died ended up with a cycle count above 24, which is relatively low amount of virus being swabbed. So, there's not a correlation there. These tests can't really quantitate how sick you're going to be or how infectious you're going to be. It's a yes/no. It's a yes/no test. Do you have replicating virus in your body or not? Yes or no. And these tests are quite good at telling that. So, anyway, it's been frustrating because there's been just an enormous amount of nonsense pumped out. The last thing I would say is that people do not understand how the tests are used, because a test is a tool in a doctor's tool bag. And so, and it's one of multiple things. And so if you look at so when you go in and you're see a doctor and they diagnose you with COVID, you're gonna go through, or the doctor's going to go through a diagnostic procedure. These procedures are precisely laid out. There are these things called ICD codes that for every diagnosis, there's a code.
Yeah.
It's a universal international standard. It's used, throughout most of the world. And each code defines a specific set of procedures. A test is one component in a whole series of procedures. And so basically, in order for a doctor to officially give you a U07.2 ICD code, which it means COVID with a test, they have to see certain symptoms. They have to see, a positive on a test. But if they see certain symptoms and the test is negative, they can still diagnose you, because they're not a robot. They're not relying on the test. They're relying on a whole series of factors that they're able, to use their professional judgment to look at you and determine, is this COVID, or is it the flu, or is it allergies? And, so there are very, very, well thought through complex procedures to come up with a diagnosis. It's not just a test.
Yeah.
The test is an important part, but largely the test confirms what the doctor has already largely been able to figure out by simply examining the patient, doing lung scans, looking at symptoms, things like that.
And if I could ask, and I think, Jack, this might be an area you might be able to chime in on. Like with COVID-19 specifically, like there's been a strong emphasis on the importance of testing, and obviously with that there's been a lot of doubts. But Jack, with COVID-19 and the way that it spreads, I've heard that it spreads a lot more easily than many other viruses. And there's something to say about the mortality rate, but specifically with COVID and this pandemic, why are these tests really important, and like what do they tell us about the way that people should be behaving in certain cities, or where they're hearing that a lot of people are testing positive and stuff?
Sure. Before I answer your question, and I certainly will, I did want to step back and
go ahead.
First, I want to reinforce and echo what Dale was saying about the importance of testing and the reliability of believing a positive. And in deference to what I would imagine is not a particularly technical audience, and forgive me if that comes off as condescending or insulting. It's not how I intend it. But just to explain how these PCR tests work, if you think of what's going on in a PCR reaction, like having just a huge bag of loose Lego bricks, okay? And the PCR reaction is to take like a mimicking tool and show it, right, the Millennium Falcon, right? Put the Millennium Falcon and you give it loose bricks, and the mimicking tool just builds the Millennium Falcon. But if you take the Millennium Falcon out there and you put in the Batmobile, it will build the Batmobile, but it can
Yeah.
only build what it sees. So if the template isn't in the tube, you're never going to randomly wind up with the Batmobile just accidentally thrown together, right? So when we say, all right, mimicking tool, here are your loose Lego bricks, build me what you find. If it builds the Batmobile, we know for sure that the Batmobile was in the tube. And in this case, obviously, the analogy is the Batmobile are these genes for the COVID virus. So there's statistically almost no way that you could accidentally build a Batmobile out of loose Legos if you didn't have one to look at. And I hope that makes sense to the people sort of playing along at home. And then you'll have to forgive me, Hiram. I forgot what your question was. Please ask me.
No worries. I like, what does testing help us understand about the virus? Like, I think Dale, touched on it a little bit, but like when people are looking at numbers, like 25 million people are infected with COVID, or we at 29 million confirmed positives. What are we learning from these tests, and why are they an important component to us combating the virus?
Yeah, I think what we're learning from these tests is something that Dale touched on when he was speaking about it, is the prevalence of asymptomatic cases. Most people, when they feel sick, right, then you kind of know you're sick. But if you don't feel sick, it's counterintuitive to think I have an active, ongoing viral infection. And in the absence of these very precise, very accurate tests, we likely wouldn't know that these asymptomatic cases were prevalent and capable of being spread. And I think that's the problem. So there's this sort of disconnect intuitively to, I don't feel sick, but you're telling me that I am, and the sort of downstream potential ramifications of having an asymptomatic case, spreading it to somebody else who definitely does have wind up with a symptomatic case, winds up on a ventilator in a hospital, or God forbid, I won't even say it, but I think what testing is showing us is that the viral infections on a population scale are more insidious than something like, right? If you think as playfully, and I don't mean to make this seem silly, but if you think of that scene sort of early on in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where there's a guy in a wheelbarrow just ringing a bell, bring out your dead, and they're sort of piling dead bodies onto the wheelbarrow, right? The bubonic plague, people knew they were sick. You got these bubonic lesions and things like that, and you either had it or you didn't, and there was this very binary sort of check or check minus kind of scenario. In a situation like we're seeing on a population scale with COVID, we don't have that. There's this very sort of sliding scale where some people are entirely uninfected and have not been exposed to the virus. And then there's people who've been exposed to the virus but didn't really have a broad infection and weren't shedding the virus, is how we use that, shedding the virus so that it could be spread. And then all the way up to people who are on ventilators and who passed away. Yeah. And so, I think what testing has confirmed for us is that the virus itself is much more insidious in a population than it would otherwise have seemed.
Yeah. That's great, because Dale Jetson.
Well, I mean, one of the quick thing I'd throw in too is that part of what makes COVID insidious is this long period of asymptomatic transmission that can occur. And what a lot of people don't understand, I think there's a lot of sort of naive understanding of infectious disease in the population. Because we live in an era where there's relatively little infectious disease outside colds and influenza. But a viral infection does not make you feel sick. Your own inflammation system, it's your own immune response that makes you feel sick. So all those things of, a fever, a headache, coughing, muscle ache, all of those symptoms that you get when you know you're coming down with the flu, it's not the flu virus. It's your own inflammation response that's gearing up to fight the infection. And there are a lot of viruses that basically are actively fighting against your immune system's ability to recognize an infection. And so can sit there and replicate away for quite some time. And so you're walking around with enough of a viral load that you can infect people around you, and you feel absolutely fine. And and I think this has been very confusing for a lot of people. And so if you compare something like Ebola, which is very deadly and extraordinarily contagious, but never really generates massive outbreaks. And the reason why is that pretty quickly after you're infected, you're bleeding from your eyes, which is a pretty good sign for everybody to stay away from you. And so even though you have a more infectious, much more deadly virus, it has a very difficult time transmitting simply because it presents symptoms so rapidly after infection, where COVID, you walk around, you're perfectly fine, and you're breathing on, people around you and getting them sick. And so this is where not just testing is important, but why contact tracing is important. And this is why the only countries that have not let this thing just burn the forest down have been countries like South Korea and China and Japan and Australia and New Zealand and Singapore. And they do it through contact tracing. So let's find someone who we actually know has the disease, and then let's go back and figure out who they had contact with, and then let's test those people, and so that we can catch people while they're still asymptomatic. That's an extraordinarily effective process that the U.S. has chosen to not do, as have the UK, most of South America, and most of Europe has just refused to do the hard work of contact tracing and testing.
Yeah.
And without that, we're not going to ever get this thing under control.
Yeah. Yeah. And with some of the political maybe aspects of this particular virus, what are some things that are most concerning to you when it comes to like understanding the way that the virus spreads or the way the tests work? Like what is one thing that gives you the guarantee or that feeling of confidence that the science supersedes the political like back and forth of the testing and stuff? Like, why do you guys agree? In other words, like what gives you that confidence?
I think I would ask your question differently. And sorry to keep getting asked questions and refusing to answer them. I wouldn't say that the science supersedes the political conversations. I would say that the science is an entirely different conversation. There are certain things that are inherently apolitical. And public health crises are one of them. This is not a political matter. There shouldn't be questions about tax policy or infrastructure or anything like that, which are political matters. When people are dying in such great numbers that we've literally, had to start putting dead bodies in refrigerated tractor trailers. Like this isn't a political discussion, and it should never have been. Or never should have been, because words are important. So I don't have an opinion on politics, and I know that people who may have known me or only gotten to know me in the last few years would find that hard to believe. But my only investment in politics is to keep politics out of science. Science is true whether or not you believe it. It's not the tooth fairy. I don't. Yeah, sorry, I don't know how.
That's kind of what I was thinking as well. I worded my question a little bit weird because I thought about it as you were speaking, but it seems like when we're talking about this discussion, we're really sticking to a lot of really objective, widely understood and accepted notions of what the virus is, how it spreads, but it seems like as soon as you step away from that scientific academic conversation, all of a sudden everything gets muddled in politics, and there's just no more science behind it or consistency, right, in our understanding. So
well, and the other thing to point out too is that when you see a rise in positive tests and a rise in diagnosed cases of COVID, you always see a rise in hospitalizations 2 weeks later. And you always see a rise in deaths 3 to 4 weeks later. This is the standard disease progression. If tests weren't working, you would see all kinds of rises and fallings in diagnoses, with the hospital rates and the death rates being completely out of sync. But the deal is, you draw these curves out and you time shift them, because it takes a certain amount of time to go from a diagnosis to being sick enough you have to be hospitalized, and a certain amount of time from being sick enough to be hospitalized to dying. You basically time shift these curves, and they're absolutely identical. They lay right on top of one another, which means that there is a very direct connection between how many people test positive and how many people are going to die. And and this has been true in every single nation, through every single wave of this epidemic since the beginning. So there's no surprises here. And as soon as we see cases start to rise, you can very easily predict what the death rate is going to be a month, month and a half out. So it's not like the government is trying to trick people. You can count up the bodies in the refrigerator trucks and get some sense of how many people were sick.
No, and that's. Go ahead.
Sorry, Hiram. It's what I think one of the biggest issues was in terms of public trust, which I think is kind of what was being hinted at, and why this became a political issue, is truly that this was unprecedented in terms of sort of the scientific method being sort of broadcast 24-hour news cycle in real time in front of a non-technical audience. And what I mean by that is this is a generational sort of once in a century, hopefully once in a century type experience. There have been sort of smaller pandemics since the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 and 1919, but nothing that's ever approached this scale. So what happened, and really what happened for the first time, at least as far as we know in human history, is that the sort of inelegance in the earlier stages of the scientific method were sort of broadcast for people to see. And what I mean by that is we like to think as a public, not when I say that, not as a community of scientists, we like to think that science is very linear and it never gets things wrong. And the answer is we get things wrong all the time, and we do it on purpose. Right? So we start at a problem and we branch out in every direction. And soon you find out that the first direction you went was wrong, and then suddenly the 95th direction is still wrong. And it might not be until you're at, direction 1,000,002, but you went off in infinite directions in 360-degree space. And we saw all the different wrong directions, all the different wrong things. But it's important that you make those types of conclusions, that you get to a point where you know that a certain hypothesis is wrong, so you can cross that off the list. And as rapidly and as publicly as this sort of engulfed everyone's lives, the idea that so many scientific groups ran in the wrong direction seemed an awful lot like we didn't know what we were doing. And the candid, if perhaps unexpected answer is we didn't know what we were doing. This is an entirely novel virus. What we did know was we knew how to figure out what to do pretty quickly. So we knew when things were wrong, that they were wrong, and we knew when things were right all the time. We do it on purpose. Oh, this is my voice from a minute ago coming through. But yeah, this sort of public broadcasting of the scientific method in real time could likely have contributed to a sort of public questioning of the scientific conclusions.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing I also will point out is that science is not unique to science. Every time we fight a new war, we start by fighting the last war. And the classic example is, early in the Second World War, the U.S. got its ass handed to it over and over again. You had Pearl Harbor, you had the Philippines, you had, the disaster at Kasserine Pass in North Africa, where the U.S. was fighting like they were still fighting World War I. And, and so what happened was a lot of people died, and a lot of, A lot of admirals and a lot of generals made a lot of very, very bad choices, but we learned. And then out of that came things like the D-Day landings and and the island campaign in the Pacific that was very successful. So I think every time you're exposed to a new environment, you start by fighting the last war because that's what you know. And a few things that are interesting about COVID that made it very unusual was one, this was an extraordinarily contagious virus compared to anything we've seen basically since measles 60 years ago. And we haven't seen measles in since 62, 63 when the vaccine was introduced. So I think a lot of people were not prepared for a virus that was this contagious, even within the scientific, especially the infectious disease community. The other thing was that you had not seen pure airborne transmission of a virus again since about the measles 60 years ago. Now, again, there are tropical viruses that do this, but in terms of widespread virus, and widespread transmission in Western countries, we haven't seen things that look like COVID for 60 years. And so there was literally no infectious disease person and no scientist alive today who was professionally involved at a time when anything looked like this virus had ever existed. And so you start with your assumptions that, upper respiratory RNA viruses are transmitted through droplets, not through aerosol. So masks aren't going to be effective. That turned out to be wrong. And that turned out to lead to the nursing home deaths in the early part because you had aerosol transmission through air handling systems in nursing homes. So, so previously, all of the protocols had been around surface transmission, controlling surface transmission and controlling droplet transmission. And so there were very strict protocols in nursing homes to contain respiratory infections. What they didn't count on was an aerosol-based infection that could pass through the air handlers, so that even though you kept someone isolated and you kept the surfaces cleaned, that just them breathing could be picked up by the air handlers, spread throughout the facility, and infect everyone. Yeah. And it just took time and mistakes. And again, it took a few Pearl Harbors, in February and March and April for people to really come to grips with how different this was and how this thing actually worked. And and there were a number of things, again, and specifically in the infectious disease world, where there were assumptions that you could not have a virus be airborne unless its replication number was above a certain level. And so the assumption was this, COVID wasn't, or SARS-CoV-2 wasn't infectious enough to be, to fit within the model of what could be expected through airborne transmission. And it turns out that the mechanics were slightly different than what people were expecting. It's actually technically not an airborne virus, but an aerosol-borne virus. And so it sort of breaks that historical model. But, so there were a lot of mistakes made because people were fighting the last war, the last infection. And it's just taken some time. And again, one of the things you see played out by the deniers is they love to go back and, quote Fauci in mid-February when he says masks aren't necessary, and completely ignore the very overwhelming solid science that, that has accumulated since, April and May of last year. And so you see a lot of this kind of nonsense going on. But the fact is, science progresses. It's what makes science different than religion. Religion, they know the total truth. They just go back to the book and it's there and nothing changes. Science, everything changes. And, and everything you thought you knew, last year and last decade, can change this year.
Yeah.
So, and that's what we're seeing is we're watching science play out on the public stage in all its messiness.
Yeah.
I've sort of regularly remarked that my opinions are really very easily swayed. All it takes is solid, reproducible evidence. And I think Dale's example of early suggestions or early recommendations that against masks versus the certainly later and current recommendations for masks at all times in public and regularly changing them, etc., is an excellent example of being willing to change your opinion based on the available evidence. As more evidence came in and the conclusion became more and more clear, you have to change your opinion. Otherwise, you're just being intractable for no reason. So yeah, there's something to be said about having a conviction or commitment to science as a process. And the most important thing about science as a process is that you have to be willing to change your opinion based on the evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. And I really appreciate you guys sharing that, because I think that's, one of the things that's really hard to grasp if you're not in the scientific community. Some of these shifts could seem, if you don't have the technical knowledge, is like, shifts due to like, manipulative and just profit driven, hungry people that are just, trying to, scare everyone else into, doing things, and then like just changing their minds as they please just because they're like toying around with society. But absolutely, it's important to keep in mind that, some of this stuff is just coming to us, for the first time in so many years. Like Dill, you mentioned, we're fighting a war that, we fought before, but we're fighting it now in a completely new way. And I wanted to ask about the vaccine. There's many people that have a lot of concerns about the vaccine. And I know both of you have extensive knowledge on the vaccine and its development.
Can I jump in just real quick with, this is a question that I had noticed had come up that I think is useful. That's a confusion. And Jack, probably knows more about this than I do, but the question of what's the difference between airborne versus aerosol. And so basically viruses have a tough time living outside a host organism. And they typically are mechanically very unstable, meaning that they literally will fall apart like an old junker car. And so a lot of viruses will transmit through what are called droplets, so large droplets of liquid, and they're inside the liquid. The question is how small the droplet can be and still sustain the virus. And so the difference between droplet transmission and aerosol transmission is really you're inside a liquid droplet. How small can that droplet be, and you still, the virus still hold together. Airborne transmission is where you don't necessarily need the droplet. The virus can hold together long enough, and my understanding is measles is an example of this, where you can get direct transmission between people without necessarily having the virus directly in a droplet or in an aerosol. An aerosol or droplet. The only difference between aerosol and droplet is the diameter of the little droplet of liquid. But and this was an interesting point of confusion early on, because people didn't really, infectious disease people. And again, I work in testing, so I tend to work a lot with infectious disease specialists. And a lot of ID people were thinking in a very binary way between airborne, pure airborne, like the measles, and pure droplet transmission, like influenza or like the common cold. And they weren't thinking in terms of aerosol transmission. And aerosol transmission really changes the rules. The distance over which you can transmit it, how long it can hang in the environment, the ability to be picked up by air handlers, and be passed to different rooms in a building. All of these things are come into play with aerosol when in a way that they don't really come into play even with pure airborne viruses, and certainly not with droplet viruses. And again, Jack, I'm sure has a good deal more experience on this than I do.
Yeah, again, just trying to make some of this more accessible to a broader audience, to reinforce some of what Dale said. Viruses, just in general, are very unique in the world of biology, insofar as they're not really an organism. They're they're not alive on their own. They do need a host cell to replicate and make copies of itself. But if you think about what a virus is, it's a little packet of proteins with some genes inside of it, and it's think of it more like a ham sandwich. If I take a ham sandwich and I leave it out on the counter, I can come back to it in an hour and it might still be pretty much the same ham sandwich. But if I come back to it a week later, it's going to be a completely different sandwich and you're not going to want to eat it. And that's the same kind of thing that Dale was alluding to with this transfer of viruses between hosts. There's a limit to how long an actual viral particle can survive, so to speak, can remain viable, can stay an edible ham sandwich when it's not inside a host. And so these different ways that a virus can be transmitted between hosts really just describe how long the virus still describes how long that ham sandwich remains edible until it finds its way into a new fridge or a new sandwich bag or whatever. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, I think Dale's point about aerosols in general help us transition into a conversation about how masks actually work in preventing the spread of the virus. These viruses, because they're not really alive, they don't move on their own. There's no decision-making process. They're not really attracted to anything. They're just little particles. It's like, if you sneeze, a little droplet of snot might fly out of you. That snot is no more alive than the virus is. So they need to be carried on the word we use is vectors. It sort of helps the ham sandwich get from one countertop to the next. And in the case of a virus like the one that causes COVID-19, those droplets are, I shouldn't say droplets, those vectors are limited in their ability to travel when they hit a physical impediment like a mask.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say on masking is that, again, this is another piece of nonsense that I still see being perpetrated. The virus is only, X number of microns in diameter, but the mask, the openings in the mask are giant. Therefore, the virus will just fly right through, like flies through a chain link fence. And the deal is the virus isn't on its own. The virus is in a droplet, and those droplets are largely in the, around 50 microns in size, which is relatively large, significantly larger than the virus. And these masks, the way the world works at our level is radically different than the way the world works down at a much smaller level. And so, one of the things with these masks is that they provide a lot of interference that's designed to make that droplet bounce off of things and ultimately get caught on a fiber before it makes it through the mask. And if you look at the N95 mask, what makes an N95 an N95 is they have a very special material. It's called melt-blown polypropylene that has a permanent electrostatic charge. And so, every single fiber is basically has a fairly strong electrostatic charge on it. And so it's pulling those droplets from quite some distance away to the fiber. And then once that droplet hits the fiber, it's bound to the fiber like it's super glue. And so that's why the N95s are so extraordinarily effective at pulling these sorts of aerosol droplets out of the air. And the deal is there are no bare viruses floating in the air. They're all inside, typically 10 to 50 micron liquid droplets. And these masks are, this is the sweet spot in terms of exactly where these masks really, really work well. The deal is the masks are quite effective so long as you're actually breathing through them. Now, if it's under your nose or, you don't know how to wear it or it's in your pocket, then it's not going to help. But but if you're wearing it properly, these things are really quite effective. And the proof of that is the fact that influenza has literally vanished from the planet in the last year, in an extraordinary way. And the reason why is that influenza is a virus that is even more effective at being stopped with a mask than the SARS virus. It's less infectious. It tends to require larger droplets, which are even more effective for the mask. And what you see is we are at historically, I mean, since the beginning of recording influenza rates, we are at the lowest levels in history right now. And it's because people are, doing distancing, wearing a mask, doing a few basic things that simply make influenza go away. And it's no surprise because we have 20 years of data on this out of Japan and South Korea and China and Taiwan, where mask wearing, and Vietnam is another one, where mask wearing is, a standard socially accepted, socially expected practice during the winter. And so, we know that these things work. So somebody just asked, what's the second best mask if you can't get an N95? The best mask, absolutely, is actually a KF94. So this KF94 is the N95 standard out of South Korea. And they're available. You can get them on Amazon directly from South Korean manufacturers. But the South Korean government is very strict on their standards, very strict on letting these things be exported. And the big problem with N95s right now is that close to 100% of them on the market are counterfeit. That the counterfeiting problem with these masks are out of control in the U.S. And and so almost certainly any of the 3M brand name mask. If you can find one in the retail market, it's counterfeit. You can almost completely guarantee it's counterfeit. That pretty much all of the quality, real 3M masks are being diverted into the medical supply chain and are simply not available in the retail market. But we're seeing enormous numbers of these being imported from China. As 3M masks, with full licensing data inside it, because you can print anything. It's
yeah. But I think, if I may, there's an important. I'm not sure who asked the question, or I would respond to you by name. So forgive me for that. But there's an important distinction. I think
3M masks with full license.
Well, yeah, I keep getting that occasional feedback. But yeah, an N95 mask is designed for a very specific context, and it's very unlikely that a non-scientist or a non-COVID facing medical professional would be in a context like that, where an N95 mask would be mandatory, would be sort of the mandatory minimum to provide protection. So when I was working with pandemic viruses, the most potent virus that I ever worked with was responsible for about 1 million deaths in the late 70s. And I had to wear an N95 mask working with that. I had to shave my face completely because even having a relatively close shaven beard like I have now would keep the mask higher up off my face than it would need to be to confer that type of sort of airtight protection around my face. But the N95 that I wore, they come in different shapes and sizes, just like people's faces do. So it was actually a process I had to go through to get professionally fit tested by the different manufacturers that make N95s to know that the one I bought and put on my face was going to protect me from the virus that I was working with.
Yeah.
The reason why I needed that was because I was going to be in a tight, enclosed environment where I was certain that there were large amounts of concentrated live virus around. And that was designed to protect me from sort of breathing in or otherwise being exposed to a virus. The masks that are the sort of the cloth mask or whatever, or even just, taking a bandana like it's the 1880s and you're robbing a stagecoach. they are designed and intended to do an entirely different function. And what I mean by that is, again, these serve as a physical impediment to stop the droplets that come flying out of your face from traveling far enough to infect the person beside you if you have COVID. So they certainly can minimize the risk that you will get it, but it's different. It's not like necessarily wearing a seatbelt where you put the seatbelt on because if I get in an accident, I don't want to die. It's like I'm putting my seatbelt on because if I get in an accident, I don't want to get shot out of my windshield and kill the guy beside me. And that's a different thing. And it's a motivation that might seem difficult to grasp for us, but it's also one of the reasons why masks are only as effective as the number of people actually willing to wear them in good faith.
Yeah.
So the masks that I used to wear when working with that pandemic virus were intended to protect me. The masks that I wear when I leave my house now to go to the grocery store are intended to protect other people from the chance that I might have an asymptomatic but transmissible case of COVID.
And the most effective mask is worn by someone who is infected and doesn't know it yet.
Yeah.
And so if you feel fine, that's an indication you should definitely wear a mask because what we need to do to slow down the transmission is to get these asymptomatic carriers to quit breathing on people. By the time you're running 104 fever, you're not, out at the Kroger store. You're home in bed, and you may infect your family, but you're not going to be infecting strangers. It's these asymptomatic carriers out in public, that are continuing to spread this thing.
Yeah, and if I could ask. With the mask and everything, many people are now, focusing a lot of their energy and a lot of their time in investigating and learning about the vaccine. And I know masks were like the initial push towards like preventing the virus. But now, like many are focusing on pushing the vaccine. But with that, there's a lack of trust in the vaccine. And I definitely like to spend some time talking about that. I know, Dale, you have some experience and some knowledge about like, how the vaccine was developed and specifically like, I was wondering like, if I were to get the vaccine, like what kind of mercury would be getting injected into my arm, or is it something else?
Depends on how much tuna fish you ate that day. But that's going to be the only source of mercury you're getting.
Yeah.
I mean, the mercury stuff, again, is incredibly stupid crap. It was used once historically. There's not a single vaccine that's been made in a very long time that uses it. When it was used, it was a compound with a single mercury molecule in a very complex compound that was not biologically active. And it was designed to be a preservative in the vaccine, and they've been replaced with other things. But the other thing about these, certainly the mRNA vaccine, so the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, if you look at the ingredient list on those things, these are the most extraordinarily simple ingredient list in a vaccine we've seen in more than probably 70 or 80 years. They've got no preservatives. They have no adjuvants. That it's basically just a container called a VLP, a viral-like particle that's fabricated from lipids, which are essentially fat molecules that hold a small RNA strand, and then that's suspended in water with some basic salt, and the salt is there just to make sure that the solution is pH balanced to your bloodstream, and a very tiny amount of sugar, just basic sucrose. And the sugar acts as a stabilizer that keeps that little globule of fat molecules from mechanically disassembling. It stabilizes it. So basically you have water, table salt, basic sugar, and tiny, very tiny amounts of these little fat molecules that are then containing the RNA. And that is it. There's nothing else in these vaccines. And
Yeah.
so not even any microchips. And
Darn, I was hoping to get that
But
microchip.
to come back, and I know this is a tangent, so I won't dwell on this, but it is important to again reinforce something that Dale said about the complex compound that he was referring to that contained one atom out of several atoms that was a preservative is a compound called thimerosal, and there weren't any dangers associated with that. You have to understand that when individual atoms come together to form a compound, what makes them a compound is that those atoms are chemically distinct from their individual elemental building blocks. If you took sodium on its own and dropped it in water, it would literally explode. If you take sodium and chloride and mix them together, it's a nice seasoning for your eggs in the morning. So we need to understand that there's a difference there. But the practical ramification of the uneducated or misinformed complaints about the use of that preservative was that we stopped using that preservative in vaccine manufacturers. And that was largely in response to these sort of boutique causes that come from areas of privilege. And I know that this is going to sound strange, but we stopped using it to placate, wealthy-ish stay-at-home moms or whatever who were upset about the fact that chemical compounds might sound scary. And realistically, what that did was limit our ability to distribute vaccines in larger sort of multi-dose vials to areas that lack the kind of cold chain storage to keep vaccines either refrigerated or frozen in largely underserved, and if you'll forgive the term, third world countries, right? It's easy-ish. It's difficult for us now with the current sort of spate of mRNA vaccines in them. I can't wait to start talking about them. I really can't. To store them at minus 80 degrees Celsius in this country, right? We have a large, relatively stable power grid. Forgive me for bringing that up, Texas. I know those. But if you're venturing out into a desert or into a jungle or wherever, it's not like you're going to strap one of those minus 80 freezers to your back and trek through the forest with it. And so by responding to what really was misinformed groups of people badly understanding science in a way that was just to appease them so they stopped complaining, all that really did was limit a poor person in another country's ability to get vaccinated against a deadly disease. And that's all those people effectively accomplished. And that's dramatically dangerous. It's dramatically unfair. And it's one of those things where if we could just stamp out the misinformation and educate people better about basic sort of high school level chemistry, we would be able to save more lives even than we're saving now.
And to put it in even more brutal terms, I mean, you had a small cadre, of wealthy, ultra privileged people running campaigns whose primary effect has been to kill children overseas, because the inability to get these vaccines in remote locations in Central America and Central Africa, and be able to vaccinate people against, what are very deadly diseases over there, is now lessened because of that. And so, the primary outcome of the anti-vaxxer movement is the death of a lot of kids. It's other people's kids. So that's okay. And they're different colors.
Yeah, there's a whole, what's interesting is I saw some in the comments earlier mention that, the kind of the reverse of what you said, almost kind of saying that forcing people to take the vaccine was racist because, in previous years, we've observed minority communities, as guinea pigs for vaccines we didn't understand thoroughly. But, through this discussion, it seems like, the vaccine is pretty simple to understand in terms of its ingredients, and maybe even relatively safe. And not administrating the vaccine is more dangerous and actually killing children and disproportionately affecting minority communities, but it's I found it really curious how somebody, made the argument saying this is racist because minority communities are the guinea pigs in a dangerous vaccine that we don't understand, that probably contains ingredients that would make you explode, in like 2-3
Yeah.
weeks.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I am passionate about this, so I'm going to
Please do.
to keep my emotions in check. But there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
And I think the first thing I'm going to do is address the very, very legitimate concerns that communities of color have in expressing distrust of their governments in general, and I suppose of medical treatments that are recommended by their governments in particular. It was, less than a century ago that we had the Tuskegee experiments, where men of color, black men, were deliberately withheld treatment for syphilis, even though treatments existed, because the scientists at the time wanted to see the full course of disease untreated. That's cruel and it's ridiculous. As a scientist now, I would be failing in my duty as a sort of public facing force for good to pretend that those things never happen. What I'm also not going to do is kowtow to the mistakes that were made by people who don't represent me and what I stand for, or anything like that. When it comes to how the communities of color are impacted now, in the present tense, there are lives that we can save, and it's really that simple. When it comes to how quickly this vaccine was developed, there are a number of things about the process and the experience that are unique, that all sort of coalesced to sort of give us shots on target in record speed. The first of which is that this isn't the first sort of deadly outbreak of a coronavirus. It's something that I said when I was on months ago. I don't know. Time is a black hole. I have no idea how long ago it was. That there are thousands of coronaviruses. So we use the term coronavirus in everyday speak to refer specifically to this one, but that doesn't mean that there aren't thousands of others. This is a large family of viruses. But the MERS and SARS outbreaks, both within the last 20 years or so, are also coronaviruses. And having worked with those coronavirus outbreaks in the past gave us sort of starting areas to make educated guesses. Now, as Dale mentioned, sometimes those educated guesses failed us when it came to masks. Other times, they absolutely benefited us when it came to understanding the fusion proteins. When we mentioned before that viruses are not particularly alive, they need to get inside of a host cell in order to do stuff, namely make more copies of itself. It doesn't do that by sort of busting down a wall like the Kool-Aid man, right? What it does is it engages a receptor on the surface of its host cell, and then every virus has a version of what's called a fusion protein, and that fusion protein sort of creates a way for its. So this is my virus particle. When it touches the fusion protein, to open up, so that the contents that were inside the viral packet now are inside the cell, and the contents of the viral packet sort of fuse with the membrane of the cell. It's very oversimplified. I know if there are scientists following along that what I said isn't entirely accurate, but for the purposes of this discussion, it's important to know that fusion protein, the spike protein it's called, is the same. It's a similar protein to the ones that worked for that same function in MERS and SARS. And people have been working for decades already trying to develop vaccines against those proteins. Once we were able to confirm that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was the same, used this same spike protein as its fusion protein, we were able to mobilize as a community of scientists pretty quickly to shift all of our focus to developing vaccines to those, just the spike proteins. Another thing in general is that vaccine development and really pharmaceutical development in general is a very expensive process. And more often than not, as far as I know, this is the only time this has ever happened, but I'm loath to speak in absolutes. So as far as I know, this is the only time this has ever happened. More often than not, a company will wait for the clinical trials, tolerability, efficacy, which are all different trials over a period of time. Will wait for all of those results to come in before they start scaling up manufacturing, because global manufacturing processes, and that's not just a series of words that I picked out because they're descriptive. GMP is a very specific set of manufacturing requirements for pharmaceuticals. It's because it's very specific, it's very rigorous to ensure that what goes into people is safe, is expensive. It is. So the fact that these companies started manufacturing millions of doses in bulk at risk before they got the results of their clinical trials, so that when they got the results, the clinical trial safety and efficacy data were positive, they would immediately have enough vaccine to start distributing and saving lives. That's what happened here. And that type of at-risk manufacture was a multi-billion-dollar gamble by all the companies that undertook it. It's also worth pointing out that there were over 200, maybe not over 200, about 200 different research groups that all attempted to develop a vaccine. As far as we know, 3 of them actually succeeded, right? And that's about a 99% failure rate, which shows that even when we're responding in record time as quickly as we can, because people are literally dying by the thousands, the system is still discriminating and discerning and effective at eliminating products that don't work.
Yeah.
So when it comes to responding to the history, we can't deny the history. There are certainly reasons for communities of color to be suspicious when they're approached by their government and said, "Here, try this." And we would be foolish and dishonest to deny that that's the case.
And you mentioned this is, go ahead.
I'm sorry, knowing that that's the case, but knowing also that communities of color are disproportionately affected by the current ongoing real-time deadly virus, it would also be foolish and dishonest of us to defer only to the problematic history and neglect that there are lives at stake now. So we can and we should, as a community of scientists and other people with other proclivities, can and should, as a community of governments and politicians, address and hopefully redress the wrongs of yesterday. But that doesn't mean that we should neglect the problems of today in order to do so.
Yeah.
I know I went off on a pretty long diatribe. Sorry.
Well, and to add to that, because I've got some understanding of some of the history of the regulatory process that's in place today, and what you see is that we're at the end of about a 60-year-long process of really, putting in very stringent regulations around drug development and drug testing and drug deployment. And a lot of that came directly from, some really horrendous things that were done during, looking at syphilis, during the development of the polio vaccine. There were some major mistakes that were made that killed a lot of people, both in the early trials in the mid-30s, and then even after the Salk vaccine was developed and deployed, you had manufacturing errors that killed people. That almost completely killed the polio program until the Sabin vaccine, was then redeployed in the early 60s. But you had basically poorly regulated manufacturing. You had, and just an honest manufacturing error that was made. It was about 1956, where you had polio vaccines that gave people live polio. They gave them full-blown polio, and it almost completely killed the polio eradication effort until a completely different vaccine was deployed, the Sabin vaccine. So, but out of that, starting about 1960, you really started to see a very hard look at the regulatory process, and we're the beneficiaries of now more than a half a century of work trying to strengthen that process, and not just in the U.S. I mean, Europe has also looked at this, and most of the Asian countries follow similar protocols. So, it's a very different world now than it was 60 or 80 years ago. In the same way that I still wear cotton shirts, even though 160 years ago, cotton was made by slaves. That's something that was terrible and is corrected. But cotton's not made by slaves today, and I'm wearing cotton shirts. So things change, and we're in a different world.
Yeah, of course.
The other thing I was going to mention too is, there's a lot of nonsense around, the vaccine must be dangerous because it was made so quickly, and to kind of amplify on some of what Jack said, one of the things that people don't see is the financial infrastructure behind drug development. And one of the things about vaccines is vaccines tend to be essentially a zero profit drug. I mean, no pharmaceutical company is making any profits on vaccines, at least not compared to their therapeutics. And to just step back and think for a minute, most of the vaccines that are deployed are for childhood diseases. You're doing in the U.S. You're doing about 4 to 5 million of these a year, because that's how many kids are being born each year. You get one plus maybe a booster, and that's it for the rest of your life. Compare that to Lipitor, where they're going to charge you several bucks a pill, and you take one every day, forever. So the profits in therapeutics, like things like Lipitor, that you're taking continuously forever, is radically different than something where you get one customer once in their entire lifetime. So vaccines are not financially profitable drugs for the most part for companies to be making. And as a result, there's a tendency to throttle the amount of financial investment that goes into vaccine development on an annual basis. And so, you see these programs stretch out over many years. A lot of this is simply because the pharmaceutical companies are making decisions about how much money they're willing to pour into a very low profit drug. And so the thing that's made this go around different is you had government organizations, I mean, both in Europe and the U.S., but specifically in the U.S., you had organizations like BARDA, which is essentially the biotech equivalent of DARPA. It's and I forget what the acronym stands for, but it's an advanced research projects agency out of the federal government. And BARDA directed enormous amounts of money to basically prepay for the R&D and prepay for the development of manufacturing infrastructure. And then the companies also stepped to the line, and they also invested their own money into these efforts. But what you really saw was, by prepaying for all of this at essentially an unlimited level over the last year, you're able to take what would normally take 5 to 7 years and collapse it to within a year. And it's not that they were taking shortcuts; it's that they were able to basically, the term of art is parallel development. You're able to be building the factory while you're still designing the car, and so you're able to spend money on lots of different things, knowing that a lot of those investments are going to end up being dead ends. But the urgency of the situation justifies spending that level of money on things that have a low probability of succeeding. And so a lot of what collapsed the timelines on this, it really has to do with a radically different financial infrastructure, and this sort of massive funding that governments were willing to put in, and the pharmaceutical companies were willing to match. And so that's a story that I think is largely untold. But that also is a lot of what accounts for the fact that we have these, in early 2021, and not, as I was expecting, more like the 2025 timeframe, which would have been a more typical time frame for these sort of development efforts.
Yeah, and kind of a little bit on the topic of like the way that the vaccine got developed really quickly, because obviously that's a really huge concern for many. Like, do we understand the long term effects yet of the vaccine? Should we be worried about 3 to 5 years from now? Like, would I get a heart attack because I got the vaccine, or would I get sick?
Yes, so there are. This is the first mRNA vaccine that's been approved for use in humans. But there are other nucleic acid DNA vaccines that are available. More generally, the practical ramification of the speed at which these vaccines were developed wasn't that safety concerns were sacrificed or anything like that. It's that the formulations remained in their simplest forms. Normally, for any pharmaceutical, be it a vaccine or a therapeutic, after the actual drug product, the compound that has the desired effect, the one that helps to fight cancer or clears strep throat or confers immunity in the case of a vaccine, there are other things added to it that are called excipients. And these things increase the stability of a pill or the shelf life of a vial. In the case of these vaccines, in the case of the mRNA vaccines, the reason why these have to be stored at 80 degrees below 0 Celsius is because that process was skipped entirely. So if the standard development process was sort of seen through from start to finish, pardon me, one of the things that you would see would be a more stable vaccine and a more reasonable storage temperature. In deference to, again, how many people were sick and dying and in need of a vaccine, that process was just omitted entirely. So what you're getting now is the safety tested drug product without any of the other things. Think of it like the difference between American cheese, the pasteurized cheese process, and the individual sort of Kraft singles plastic wrapped slice. You're like, this thing will survive doomsday, or like the block of cheddar cheese that you would find in some cellar in Vermont, where they're like, we've been making cheddar cheese this way for 100 years, right? They're both technically still cheese, but one of them has a longer shelf life and has had more done to it. But they're both cheese and they're both fine for you. And I think that's the difference that we're seeing here, is that this is just really the purest, most basic form of the drug product, without any of the added excipients that would make this drug product easier to store, easier to distribute, anything like that. Those concerns were not non-existent, of course, but they were put on the back burner because of the pressing need for these vaccines to be released.
Which goes to the extraordinary simplicity of the ingredient list in them.
Yeah. And would it be safe to say, or not safe to say, but would it be appropriate to assume that because the vaccine is much more simple, it's more likely to be safer in the long term? Or is that a conclusion that can't really be drawn yet?
To say that one vaccine is likely to be more safe than the next implies that there are unsafe vaccines, which is probably not a fair implication.
Yeah.
There is no reason to suspect that there would be any negative long-term effects. The long-term effects of this vaccine, hopefully, is long-lasting memory immunity in your adaptive immune system. The ingredients, so Dale mentioned them. It's messenger RNA, which your cells make constantly all the time. It's a salt buffered water solution, just to keep it from drying out. There is sugar in there, and then there are what are called lipid nanoparticles, which form a little ball of honestly just fat particles around it to encapsulate it, so that the mRNA is protected and not just floating around loose in solution. But those lipid nanoparticles are designed to mimic the cell membranes in your cells, so that when it touches a cell, the lipid nanoparticles will fuse with. I'm trying to hold my hand in the camera. Will fuse with your cell membrane and then open up and release their payload into the intercellular space, intracellular space. Excuse me. So that the mRNA molecules inside the little lipid packet end up inside your cells. So nothing in there is not already constantly, and I do mean constantly, present in your body. What vaccines do on a very, very oversimplified fundamental level is they expose your immune system to some part of a pathogen to give your immune system a chance to develop immunity to that part of the pathogen in advance without the pesky need for you getting sick first. Normally, this is done either with, in the case of like the smallpox vaccine, just giving people cowpox, right? Just giving people viruses. Good luck, you'll be fine. In this case, what the mRNA is, it's a gene. It's instructions to make a part of the viral particle itself, the whole virus, and it's just the one gene. So it's just the gene to make the spike protein. So you'll just have loose spike protein without any of the other components of the virus, and it'll get made for a very short period of time. Your immune system is very adept at recognizing this protein is me, it's self, or this protein is not me, it's non-self. So your immune system will recognize this non-self protein. It will develop immunity to this non-self protein so that the next time that non-self protein shows up, either in the form of the second dose of either the Pfizer or Moderna, will recall that initial exposure and build stronger, more robust immunity, or in the case of actually being exposed to live virus in risk of an infection, will respond to the spike proteins that, as I described before, help the virus invade and infect your cells, and hopefully prevent them from propagating for very long. That's the whole idea. But no, there's nothing. Go ahead, Dale.
Oh, I was just going to ask, there are various vaccines, right? There's Pfizer, Moderna, and then more recently, they're starting to export or receive J&J, Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And, it almost feels like you're looking through a catalog trying to pick between different vaccines. And, you hear stories about, them being different, one being safer, one not being safer. I mean, to your understanding, what are the fundamental differences between each of these vaccines? And does it matter? Like, should I, maybe if I'm, of a particular, medical condition, be concerned about the differences, or, is it the same for everyone?
What would stand out to me is the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines are mRNA vaccines, like what I've just spent a decent amount of time describing, and like what Dale was describing earlier. The Johnson & Johnson and Janssen vaccine, it's the same vaccine, it's just both companies, is an adenovirus vaccine. So an adenovirus is not a particularly dangerous or infectious virus, and they're very common. What J&J have done is they've engineered an adenovirus to express the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. Again, this protein on the virus that causes COVID-19 to be able to get into your cells. And this adenovirus has this protein antigen, but it can't get you sick. There's nothing else in there that's dangerous. So it's an entirely different approach to conferring immunity. One is just, here's the instructions on how to make this protein, and the other is, here's this protein in a way that isn't dangerous, but it's the full protein that you're exposed to. In order to do that, J&J has to be able to grow up large amounts of this virus and then sort of break it down and package it into vials for distribution. So this is something that would need, this is a conversation that would need to happen between an individual and their primary care physician. But if that individual has had negative experiences with like reactions to a flu shot, something like that, they might want to steer clear of the J&J vaccine. The odds are very high that they're similar manufacturing processes, without delving too deeply into why I'll also point out that if you have an allergy to eggs, that would be something to be concerned about in regard to the J&J vaccine. But otherwise, it's. I mean, if you ask for a scoop of ice cream in a restaurant, do you really care whether it's Breyers or Edie's or if it's your local creamery? You want a scoop of vanilla ice cream, you get the scoop of vanilla ice cream. It's only if you have very specific medical concerns that the differences between them become relevant.
Yeah, I see.
And to kind of go back to one of the questions you asked a second ago, I mean, I think the most serious side effect associated with these vaccines long term is going to be the almost certain chance that you develop COVID if you refuse to get a vaccine. The risk of COVID is completely out of proportion to any conceivable risk from the vaccine. Doesn't mean the vaccine is completely risk free, but the other thing is, we're inoculating an extraordinary number of people. I mean, by the time this process is done, this will be the largest mass vaccination program in history, certainly over the time frame. And so one of the side effects of inoculating huge numbers of people is you get to see very rare side effects. And one of the things that we're seeing out of this is, again, specifically if you look at the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, is that there's probably a higher level of kind of short-term discomfort, first 24-hour discomfort. So I get the second Pfizer shot on Monday.
Oh, wow. Awesome.
So,
you went with Pfizer. Somebody asked what vaccine you would get.
Yeah.
You had to
So,
choose.
I mean, the vaccine you get is whichever one's available.
Yeah.
So after my first Pfizer shot, I had a little bit of muscle soreness in my upper arm and shoulder that lasted about 8 hours. That was it. It was no big deal. The second one is probably going to be a little bit rougher. But again, this is discomfort. This isn't a medical issue. The one medical issue that has arisen is an allergic reaction at the rate of about 1 out of every 250,000 people who get injected. This seems to not be from. This seems to be driven from one of the lipid molecules that's on this nanoparticle, and the reason that they suspect that is that this basic nanoparticle structure has been used in humans now for about 17 years, but it's been used primarily in chemotherapy to do highly targeted delivery of chemotherapy drugs. So there's a good deal of history with using these nanoparticles, and what they've seen is that there is a certain amount of allergic reaction, non-medically serious for the most part, allergic reaction that occurs at a very, very low rate with these nanoparticles. But again, allergies never put somebody in the ICU. No one's ever been intubated because they have an allergy. But thousands of people are getting intubated every day because they have COVID. So again, you have to look at, and the analogy I'll use on that as well is, every year. Oh, sorry. So every year, there are. It's not exactly clear how many, but somewhere in the 200 to 400 range of people who die because they were directly killed by their seatbelts. That you were in an impact, you were thrown against your seatbelt in the wrong way, and you ended up with a fatal injury directly from the seatbelt itself, not from the accident. That is not a reason to not wear seatbelts, because we're saving, 20, 30, 40,000 lives a year from people wearing seatbelts. And so, there are no risk-free drugs. Everything has some risk. The question is, is the risk of use at an extraordinarily low level, on the order of, 1 per several 100,000 or 1 per several million, which is what we're seeing with the vaccines. And then is the risk of not using that device or drug or tool radically higher? and the deal is that we're dealing with an extraordinarily contagious virus that has a very high death rate.
Yeah.
And so in the same way that driving 80 miles an hour down the freeway is extraordinarily dangerous, but we have airbags and seatbelts, even though the airbags and seatbelts have killed people and regularly kill people, but at a very low level. And so but the thing that we're seeing, after millions of injections with these vaccines, is very, very little in the way of medically serious side effects. And again, you can't look at that in isolation. You have to compare that against, you're not taking the vaccine just to make Pfizer rich. Because if you think you are, you're not, because they're not getting rich off of it. You're taking the vaccine to reduce your risk, not eliminate, but to reduce your risk of catching COVID, and especially severe COVID. And so the question is, what's the risk of the seatbelt versus what's the risk of an 80-mile-an-hour crash into the back of an 18-wheeler? And it turns out the risk of the seatbelt is pretty minor compared to the risk of smacking into the back of the 18-wheeler. That's what we're looking at.
Yeah, and just again to maybe flesh out and reinforce what Dale was saying, there is really no evidence of dangerous, severe side effects from receiving these vaccines. And another way that we can say that, though, is, and it's something that I probably should have brought up when we were talking about just the expediency with which the vaccines were developed, is how big these clinical trials were. There were 40, 50,000 participants in these clinical trials that were all enrolled within, say, a 6-week span, which is unheard of, both in terms of its size and just getting that many people to volunteer to be involved in a clinical trial in the first place. The ramifications of vaccinating that many people in such a tightly observed and controlled environment is that it's not that none of those people will ever experience a negative medical outcome as after getting the shot. It's whether the shot caused that outcome, right? It's a logical fallacy called ad hoc ergo propter hoc. It came after, so it was necessarily caused by, and that's not the case. There's a difference between correlation and causation. I am certain, I don't know for sure, but in the abstract, on a statistical level, I'm certain that some of the I think it was 44,000 people, but I could be a little off on that. But of the tens of thousands of people involved in these clinical trials, I'm certain that one of them is dead, right? One of them may have had a heart attack. One of them, had a brain aneurysm, whatever it is. There is no evidence that those heart attacks, brain aneurysms, my toe fell off. I sneezed so hard I gave myself a hernia. Whatever it is, there's no evidence that it was caused as the result of getting the vaccine. And if it were, we would see more and more of those cases as the number of vaccinated people continues to go up. So,
and
go ahead.
No, I really like that you mentioned that, Jack, because somebody specifically in the comment section was talking about their 76-year-old father who took the vaccine on, what was it, Sunday of this week or this last week. And then 2 days later had a heart attack. And really early on in our conversation, they asked, like, do or is there any reason to believe that the vaccine was the cause for this heart attack or this particular case of somebody having to go to the hospital? And I think that almost directly answers the question, right? And it's kind of
well, there's some interesting data from Norway, because one of the things that Norway did was they had a very structured program, and they have a national healthcare system there. So they had a very structured program to fully vaccinate nursing home residents. And, out of this, it was 200 or 300 deaths that occurred within like a week after vaccination, within their nursing home residents. And this was obviously leapt upon by the anti-vaxxers very quickly that, this is proof that the vaccine's murdering old people. And the Norwegian government and one of the universities there did an in-depth analysis of it. And basically, what they showed was that the long term, looking back over the past decade, the long term death rate, of nursing home residents in Norway was a certain number of people per week, and which turned out to be exactly the rate that you were continuing to see after the vaccination program. And so the deal is, if you've got 70 or 80 or 90-year-olds, a certain fraction of those are going to die, within a week of you saying hello to them, simply because they're 90 years old. And so you can't, just because someone has, an impact doesn't mean that impact is tied to, in this case, the vaccine. What you have to do, and again, there's a lot of work being done on this, and it doesn't mean that there are not cases that are vaccine related, but the question is, most of these bad effects, are they things that would have happened anyway had they not been vaccinated, or did they come from the vaccine? And again, especially given the fact that the majority of people who've been vaccinated so far are over 70, because that's been the early targets. If you take several million people over the age of 70, a fairly high number of those are going to be dropping dead on any given week. And so the question is, have you significantly increased the mortality rate above a baseline, above the historical baseline? And that work is being intensively done by various groups right now. And what they're seeing, after millions and millions of vaccinations, is that you're not seeing any elevation of death above the long-term historical baseline within these age groups. Now, again, that doesn't mean that a particular person's reaction was might or may not have been related to the vaccine, because that's a very different sort of thing. But part of what, this goes back to the seatbelt analogy. 200 or 300 people a year die, are killed by their seatbelts. Is that a reason not to take seatbelts? No. So again, is the incident of bad things, at a very, very low level? And then how does that compare to the incidence of bad things that are going to happen to you if you don't do this?
Yeah.
Yep.
And
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, again, just trying to reinforce what Dale was saying. It's not that nobody who's gotten a shot, especially during the clinical trials, but certainly since, it's not that nobody's gotten a shot has had a heart attack or a stroke or an aneurysm or whatever. It's not that hasn't happened. It's that when and while we have been studying these things with intense scrutiny, one, because intense scrutiny is sort of always the case for a clinical trial, but two, because the entire world is watching and waiting for these things. When people do get shots, they, on a population level, those people who do get shots don't have heart attacks, don't have strokes, or don't have aneurysms at a rate that's higher than the people who don't get those shots. And that's an important distinction to make, right? That's how we determine causation. If the rate of incident for people getting shots of a heart attack, let's say, is more frequent in people who get shots and than in people who don't, because like Dale was saying, when you reach a certain age group, those things are, morbid to say, but inevitable. And I know we've had a sort of dispassionate conversation about this, but to whomever voiced that in the chat, my father had a heart attack a number of years ago. Thankfully, he's still around. He survives on a cocktail of about 20 pills a day and has since the late 1990s. I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope your father comes through it okay.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I don't want to go over too long. We're already 2 hours into this conversation. I know we could probably be here all day because there's so much information. I still, I had a list of questions I wanted to ask, but and most of them have been answered. But there's just so many different tangents or important things to understand with some of these topics. The time is just not enough to cover. But kind of coming towards the end of this conversation, I wanted to talk about like the prospect of this pandemic, and I wanted to maybe start with Cindy's question, who asked like, what the expected length of protection for the vaccine could be? Is it 3 to 6 months? Could it be longer? I mean, what is our, what so far as our experiences, what do we expect out of the vaccine?
Well, it's we haven't yet had 6 months of vaccine approval for use, so it's tough to give an answer that would be anything other than a prediction. So this is not based on any evidence, only because the evidence doesn't exist yet. The expectation would be that there are instances where antibody-mediated immunity, which is the type of immunity that is induced by vaccines. Antibody-mediated immunity is very long-lived in your immune system. I'm talking 30, 40 years or more. We don't yet have enough evidence, if only because, right, there's no substitute for the passage of time on these things, to determine if or when the potency of the antibody-mediated immunity in this instance, generated by these vaccines, will begin to wane. What we can say, and what we can say pretty much unequivocally, is that in the short term, they prevent new infections with immediacy. They mitigate the onset of severe disease with immediacy. So
yeah,
I understand the question, and I'm sorry that I don't really have the ability to answer it. What I would say is it sounds an awful lot like trying to think about how high your cholesterol is when you've been shot in the stomach, right? Let's address the immediate need first, and in the immediate sense, it's pretty plain that these vaccines are protective now.
And on that, kind of conversation about the efficacy of the vaccine, Dale, I know that, oftentimes you've run into situations where people are wondering about herd immunity and if this vaccine, can help us, towards that goal. From your experience, what can we expect from this idea of herd immunity? Is it possible? Is it achievable at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's too early to know.
Yeah.
I mean, there are, and again, I'd love to hear Jack's thoughts on this as well. But some of what I'm about to say is, I would say is informed speculation based on what I've seen in the research. We do have now 10 months worth of data from animal studies, for instance. So we've got things more than just the vaccine trials on humans. But I think it's going to be a challenge. One reason is that the best estimates for the infectiousness of the SARS-CoV-2 virus is around an R naught of around 3.5, but the variants are up around 5. So those two numbers, those are numbers that represent the average number of people that an infected person will transmit an infection to. You compare this with, for instance, influenza, it's about 1.2. One of the things that implies is the fraction of the population that has to be protected in order for the virus to run out of host. And the implication is that number is somewhere between 70 and 80% of the population is going to have to be protected. And, I think given the current climate, certainly in the U.S., I will be stunned if we ever reach 60% vaccination levels in this country. I think we're going to permanently have 100 to 150 million people that will simply refuse to get the vaccine, and which means that you've got a massive number of potential hosts that are basically walking around buck naked. And so, as long as we have the holdouts, this thing is going to keep going. And then the second issue that has been a longstanding concern of mine since some of the very early Janssen studies with transgenic mice back last May and June with early versions of the vaccine was the fact that these vaccines don't confer effective sterilizing immunity, meaning that they don't fully protect you from infection, even though they're quite good at infecting you from disease. So the distinction is that you can get infected by a virus and transmit it to other people, even if you don't get the disease. And it has to do not with your ability to produce antibodies, but where the antibodies are produced. So are you getting antibodies produced in mucosal tissues like the nose and throat and gut? Or are you only getting antibodies produced in the bloodstream? And the classic case is the polio vaccine. Polio vaccine is non-sterilizing. And infectious disease, people who do infectious disease surveillance will periodically pick up these silent polio outbreaks. There was one a few years ago in Iceland. And what happens with polio is polio replicates in the gut. And so you take it in orally, you transmit it fecally. And you basically are not going to get infection if it stays in that path and out of the bloodstream. And so the polio vaccine, will give you lifetime immunity from allowing the virus to jump to the bloodstream, but it won't keep you from ingesting it, having it colonize the gut, and then having you pass it to others fecally. And so in that case, the lack of sterilizing immunity isn't critical. But in this case, the fact that you're not seeing it in the nose and throat, immunity in the nose and throat, that's exactly the place that you're breathing virus back out. And there were very interesting studies with what are called transgenic mice. So these are mice that are genetically modified to express human ACE2 receptors. And what they found was they injected the virus intramuscularly, these mice were completely protected from disease. They had no internal organ damage. They had very little lung damage, but they could get infected, and that they were as infectious as the unvaccinated mice were to other mice. And so that's the concern is what level of protection does these vaccines provide to stop the transmission of the virus versus simply stop disease. And so, herd immunity isn't about catching the disease. It's ultimately about, does the virus continue to transmit communally? And I think that this challenge is that, less than a fully sterilizing vaccine coupled with, roughly 35 to 40% of the population who's going to resist vaccination. And then you couple that with the complete dropping of mitigation. We're already seeing this, dropping the mask mandates, dropping all of the sort of social constraints that have kept this virus in check so far. And, my feeling is that we're going to have the opposite of herd immunity. We're going to have this virus go fully endemic, meaning you're going to end up with something where if you're vaccinated, you're going to be protected, reasonably so, but not perfectly. But you're going to have something that has the potential to be as common as the common cold, but as deadly as the flu.
To pull apart and really try to drive home the two major aspects of what Dale pointed out. The first, I think, is easier to discuss than the other, is the nature of what vaccines do. When Dale's talking about sterilizing immunity, what he means by that is getting a vaccine isn't like putting yourself inside a force field. It doesn't prevent your body from encountering the pathogen. That's not what it does. It's never designed to do that. It never will do that. What it does do is it empowers your body to fight off those pathogens faster and more potently. I generally say this by encouraging people to think about their immune system like a police station, and getting a vaccine is like loading fingerprints into the fingerprint database at the police station. Having the fingerprints on file won't stop a bank robber from breaking into a vault. What it will do is make that bank robber easier to identify and apprehend. And there's a big difference. So it's not that getting vaccinated will prevent your body ever from hosting the virus. At the very least, it would take at least one cell to have a viral particle successfully infect it such that your cells chew up the viral particles and present them to your immune system and say, hey, what's this? And so I know it might seem semantic, but at the very least, that one cell is infected by definition.
Yeah.
And so the vaccines empower you to fight off those infections faster and more potently so that you don't get those morbidities, so that you don't feel sick, so that you don't experience the types of lung capacity loss and neurological damages that we've seen as the long-term effects of being infected with COVID-19. The other thing is this idea of what herd immunity is. And this is something that I heard bandied about a lot, certainly in a political sphere, which again, as I will continue to stress, matters of public health are not political debates. But what herd immunity is and what it refers to is the idea that there are enough individuals in a herd, and this generally was originally observed if you think about a herd of cattle. There are enough members, individuals in that herd that are immune to a particular pathogen, such that the pathogen can't spread to be able to infect those few individuals that cannot become immune to it. And in this case, in our circumstance, we're talking about people who may have particular allergies to the vaccine components, something like that. But more importantly, people who are immunocompromised. Anybody who's receiving, certain cancer treatments, anyone who's ever had received an organ transplant, these people are on immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of their lives, and so they literally cannot develop immunity to these pathogens. The reason why I'm taking the time to go through this as painstakingly as I am is there is sort of a written record of a motivation to get people infected, and then having those people infected means that those people will develop immunity, and then that will lead to herd immunity. And that is a very, very dangerous thing to do, because even when we talk about infections in children, which for the most part are generally non-fatal, overwhelmingly non-fatal, that number is still not zero. And so by permitting willfully the idea that this virus can spread through children and confer herd immunity, in the abstract, that there will be a non-zero number of children who die as the result of that. And that's not what herd immunity is, right? That's genocide, eugenics, I don't know, take your pick.
That's culling the herd.
Yeah, and that's a different thing entirely. So what herd immunity is would be if when we're able to reach a point where enough of the rest of us, enough of those of us with healthy, functioning immune systems have gotten the vaccine to that limits the length of time the virus can survive within our bodies, which then limits the amount of time that we have to be able to spread the virus, that we are able to protect even those people who fundamentally cannot ever develop immunity to this virus from having to worry about it. That's what herd immunity is. It's not everyone gets sick and the people who live, that's herd immunity. No, that's an entirely different thing.
Yeah, and when I first met Dale, it's a conversation that I think I briefly mentioned to him, because I've seen many times, that people are like, well, just go get sick and then you'll be immune, and do it the old traditional way. It's safe because you're avoiding all the chemicals. But, as we know so far, first of all, that whole notion of dangerous chemicals and vaccines thrown out the window. And second of all, the idea that, going the old traditional route is effective is not only unethical, but, completely ineffective. And I see here that, there's also a question that about the mutation effect in allowing herd immunity to run without a vaccine in play.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to throw in real quick as well is this idea of, I'll take my chances with the virus because I've got a good immune system, which is extraordinarily stupid statement. But one of the things about these coronaviruses is they have a massive genome, 30,000 base genome. which means they're cranking out a huge number of proteins, about 29 separate proteins for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Every one of those proteins produces a whole constellation of antibodies in response. And so very few of which help you get rid of the virus. Um, and so one of the lines of research around long COVID, these people that have very long persistent symptoms, is that what we're seeing is the emergence of new categories of autoimmune disease that are a result of these sort of unnecessary antibodies being produced in response to the production of proteins that this virus generates during replication. Where if you look at the vaccine actually isn't even to the spike protein, is just to, I believe it's the S2 subunit of the protein, which is, if you see pictures of the coronavirus, you have like these spikes with these little mushroom tops. Well, all that matters is the mushroom top, because that's the only thing facing the outside world. And so, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine is basically just the mushroom top of that spike protein is all they've got. So you're producing, a very, very narrow range of antibodies that we know are exactly the ones you need to protect against the virus. And one of the things that you're seeing, there's a recent study that was quite interesting looking at ICU patients. And one of the things that we're seeing in ICU patients with, in the ICU with COVID, was that many of these patients had very high antibody titers, but they were missing antibodies to the spike protein. And what happens is that your immune system is making its own random choices. And it's not necessarily going to always produce exactly the right antibody that you need to get rid of the virus. Sometimes it'll produce a lot of completely unnecessary, irrelevant antibodies. And sometimes it'll simply miss the parts that it really needs to focus on. And that was what was interesting in this study, is that even though they had, obviously a strong immune system that was producing high levels of antibodies from the infection, they were missing the antibodies that were necessary to actually suppress the infection. And that was what was landing them in the ICU. And so natural infection is a real throwing of the dice. It's a shotgun blast that may or may not be what you really need, where these vaccinations are like a laser shot to exactly just the one thing that's going to be the absolute most effective at suppressing the virus in your bloodstream. And so again, it's there's a saying among virologists that viruses never kill anyone, people kill themselves. That it's your immune system that kills you. It's not the virus. So just because you think you've got a strong immune system, it's irrelevant. It's how well does it work and how quickly does it work, in the race to make sure that the other parts of your immune system doesn't kill you first. Yeah. And that's the whole point of the vaccine, is you bypass that roll of the dice. And again, for most people, it works fine. They recover and go home. For 530,000 so far this in the past year, it hasn't worked so well. And they get hauled out in a body bag. And and that's the importance of the vaccine, is that it is a significantly better solution than natural infection.
And I want to point out, throughout this entire conversation, many people may not have realized or know that Jack and Dale are meeting for the first time through this conversation, as far as my knowledge goes. And, there's just, at some point I thought, maybe we'll find points where, there's some disagreement or, some back and forth, but not at all. I mean, it seems like, obviously, as you would hopefully expect, that, there's so much consensus, around so much of this information, regarding the vaccine and the virus and the way that it works. And if you were ever wondering if it was a huge conspiracy or if scientists completely disagreed with each other on this, here's your evidence that that's absolutely not true. These two guests have never met each other, but obviously share, almost the same sentiment, about the vaccine and its importance and the way that COVID has been spreading, testing. I mean, like every single topic we've spoken about, I don't think there's been a point of friction here. If anything, you guys have been adding on to each other's, different ideas and knowledge in a way that's like, I think incredible. So I really appreciate having you guys here.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I'll point out that the reason why I'm agreeing with and reinforcing a lot of what Dale says is that Dale isn't wrong. if he were wrong, I would say something about it. But he's not, and that's I suppose as much a credit to Dale's understanding and your scheduling as it is to the nature again of how this process has worked. There are necessarily going to be mistakes made along the way when responding to an urgent public health crisis like this. But as the data come in, the data are what they are, and you don't get to reinvent them or ignore them if they lead to a place that inform you that you're wrong. And so, as we've gotten more and more data, what is true has become more and more apparent.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, with that, we've reached about 2 hours and 20 minutes of, giving so much information. And I really want to go back and, potentially, get some of the, not sound bites, but more like some of these questions, and reiterate some of this information. So really appreciate you guys putting it on the record. This is going to be useful today, tomorrow, and for, so much more time to come. I mean, the conversation I had with you, Jack, just about a couple months ago back, and I think it was like November, right? Or maybe even before that.
I think August.
Yeah, actually even as far back as August. Just recently, about a week ago, had 300 other people, jump back in and go into what you were saying and learn from the conversation we've had. So not only today, but in the future, people are going to be benefiting from all the information we've discussed today. And
one last thing I would say is to watch the variants, because I think that's the next thing to worry about. The vaccine is not a passive actor. It's fully engaged in the fight. It's not simply standing on the side of the road, waiting to get run over by the vaccine 18-wheeler. It's going to the vaccine is going to put it under evolutionary pressure, and we're already seeing the impact of that. And one of the key terms for people to watch is this concept of what's called convergent evolution. And what we're seeing are the same mutations spontaneously arising, completely independent of one another in different parts of the world. It's once enough people are infected, you start to see the virus begin to move toward a new evolutionary endpoint. And, so it's not enough to close the borders. If we have enough people infected, in our own borders, we're going to see the South African variant and the Brazilian variant and the UK variant spontaneously arise here. And what we're seeing is these variants are continuing to mutate towards some common endpoint. That it's not entirely clear what that is. And this is this idea of convergent evolution. And the way I tend to explain it is, if you've got a mountain and you've got 3 mountain climbers and they're each starting at a separate point at the base and they're each following a different line up the face, they're all going to end at the same point, the peak. And, you see this in viral evolution. And so the concern is that, the next move by the virus is going to be to escape pre-existing immunity, meaning immunity from both prior infections and immunity from the vaccines. And, and that's the reason to try to get infection stamped out quickly through all possible means, vaccines plus masking and mitigation and everything else, because as long as we've got millions of people getting infected every week, these mutations are going to keep driving the virus into new territory, and the fear I have is that, the virus ends up going endemic, and we get on a 6 to 12 month cycle of this thing continuously jumping the current vaccines, and and then the companies having to scramble to develop replacements for those, and then us going back through a revaccination effort on a periodic basis, and and that's going to make for a very, very tough environment over the next few years if we don't get out on top of this.
Yeah, and we're talking about the next few years, not the next few months. I mean, is there any expectation that by June the virus will be gone, or is this something that we're going to have to be fighting continually for a long time?
Yeah. I don't think the virus will be gone is a phrase I'm comfortable with at all.
Yeah.
It will hopefully get to a point where it is less of a mortal concern. But it's very unlikely that this virus will go away. I think it's much more likely that it will become endemic. But if you think of it more like the progression of potential outcomes for patients diagnosed with HIV and AIDS, right? Originally, that was just death sentence, and now people have it, but they live long and fulfilling lives, and there are ways to respond to it as we learn more and more about it. So I don't think I would be comfortable asserting that it would ever go away. That sounds again too absolute, but there is a real chance that we can get to a position where it is not a pressing mortal concern, but that chance is predicated on the idea that people are going to do their part, and that is sort of always the unaccounted for variable, and that's whether or not people will do what you ask them to do. And yet, when researching almost anything in a human population, right? When you conduct a mouse study, when the mice get their medicine, when they eat, when they do whatever. When you progress from a mouse study into a human study, you can't control what people do, and you never could. So, yeah, it's always a challenge. Even when people come to you and say, "I need this help," you can't account for the fact that sometimes you forget to take your pill or whatever, right? And then can that affect how a particular therapeutic can help you? Maybe. Take your medicine. I don't know what to tell you. We can't account for the human variance, the human behavior in this.
Yeah.
If I can take the chance to respond to two things. One is this idea of convergent evolution that Dale brought up. And I think his metaphor of a mountain is a good one. To discuss why that happens is, I think, worthwhile, at least very briefly. To talk about the spike protein and specific subunit of it, this sort of, like bushy top of the protein that touches your cells, receptors, surface receptors. The reason why that is particularly difficult to generate a potent immune response to just as the result of infection is the same reason why we knew that spike proteins were probably the best place to start for trying to develop immunity in the first place. These viruses can't survive is a tough word to use because they're not really alive, but they can't persist without a functioning spike protein. They can't persist if they can't infect cells, and it's only by these spike proteins that they're able to get into cells. So by limiting that function, we're able to induce immunity. But by contrast, it also means that there are certain mutations that these viruses cannot accommodate. They would be fatal, and the viruses would be rendered useless without it. It's like, right, if there was a genetic mutation in a developing embryo and a baby didn't develop a heart, like obviously that baby is not going to live. So that's kind of how this convergent evolution exists. That there are mutations because the mutations occur randomly, and it's only the ones that allow the viruses to persist or to persist better than they used to that get carried forward and drive evolution. And so certain randomly occurring mutations make the viruses less able to replicate and don't get carried forward. And that's how this convergent evolution occurs. The other thing, this might be a dangerous precedent to set, so feel free to stop me. But I've noticed that there's one member in the chat in particular with sort of lengthy diatribes and lots of exclamation points talking about these vaccines not being tested the way normal vaccines are, and dangers of blood clotting and things like that. That's just fundamentally misinformed. Right, the clinical trials absolutely were conducted. They were conducted over tens of thousands of people. One of the reasons they were able to be conducted faster than they normally are is that more and more participants were motivated to volunteer for such a study. To point out as well that the clinical trials aren't being held to a lower standard simply because there's an urgent public need for them. I think it was yesterday, but certainly this week, a late-stage candidate for approval for a vaccine by AstraZeneca had clinical trials stopped over safety concerns, right? So that's just another one of these 200 groups that didn't succeed in producing a safe and effective vaccine or even get to clinical trials. This process is incredibly robust. And the one thing that needs to be addressed, and the one bit of misinformation that needs to be dispelled, is that these vaccines were somehow subjected to a less rigorous set of clinical trials. That isn't the case. As I tried to explain before, normally these clinical trials happen in a stepwise fashion. There are questions about what's called tolerability, which would be those sort of sites of injection, irritation, allergic reactions, things like that. There are questions about efficacy. There are questions about safety. And each one of these is a different clinical trial that normally happens in a particular sequence. And the first in that sequence would be tolerability. And you would run that for several months, get that data, go back, and then respond to it. And if it's well tolerated by people, then you move on to the next stage. What happened in this case is that at risk, and by at risk, I mean at risk of wasting lots and lots of money, these clinical trials were all conducted in parallel so that we didn't have to wait. And it was a huge financial risk. I know in the case of Pfizer actually rejected money from the federal government, rejected the Operation Warp Speed funding to go off in its own direction. So Pfizer absorbed the entirety of its financial risk to be able to conduct these trials in parallel fashion to get through them comprehensively on a shorter time frame. Now, This is not a solid business model. This is a terrible idea if all you are and I mean this is a terrible idea if all you are interested in is your bottom line, right? Mm-hmm. And it's because as I mentioned earlier, something like 98.5% of companies who undertook to develop a vaccine have either failed outright or at least not succeeded yet. And there was an extremely high chance that Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson would have been one of them, right? There's a 99% chance. So by deciding at risk to throw billions of dollars at a problem and hope that it comes out, and hope that you're the 1% that actually survives this very rigorous, very in-depth clinical trial process, is a choice that is hard to justify from a business perspective, but certainly an easy one to justify from a public health perspective. So that these clinical trials all reach their conclusion faster than we normally expect them to is a product of a very risky business decision that was made, not the product of very risky science. And that is a very important distinction, and I cannot stress it firmly enough.
Yeah, like so far in this conversation, Cindy commented, and I thought it was really awesome that she said that she was fairly on a firm no for the vaccine, and now she's leaning towards taking the J&J, and says that nothing before that had swayed her to to consider the vaccine. And that just shows, the importance of sharing some of this in-depth information that, unfortunately, many people aren't willing to sit through. Not as many people as I wish would sit through, right? Because, most of the time you got like 5 seconds to convince somebody that, the vaccine is important. And how can you possibly explain in 5 seconds an incredibly intricate and complicated process, that ultimately yields in better health, but, people get confused because it's, they're only willing to give the conversation 5 seconds and not the amount of time that it deserves. And I really appreciate the fact that, you guys are willing to do that. And it, it's obviously not because you're getting paid, because unfortunately, the platform is yet, at a stage where it's profitable, but you're doing this because you're concerned about the community, right? And because people like Cindy need this information so that they make informed decisions about, whether or not they want to take the vaccine. And it's important to be informed, right? Like it's obviously like something we hope that everybody, gets to, they get to a point where they're making informed decisions. But again, you can't do that without this information first. So, man, you guys are really godsend.
Well, thank you. One thing I'd like to throw in on what Jack was talking about the HIV community. What's happened in the HIV community in the last 40 years has been an extraordinary success by any measure. And it was achieved actually without a vaccine, because we still, after 40 years, don't have an effective vaccine for HIV. But one of the things that you see in the HIV community is a wholesale buy-in to a few principles. One, rigorous mitigation. So you still see a lot of the safe sex, which is the HIV equivalent to wearing a mask and not hanging out in bars with idiots. And you're seeing a willingness to adopt the sort of antivirals like AZT that has really turned this from a death sentence into a long-term, highly manageable chronic condition, not even an illness. And I'm of a generation where I knew a lot of people who died from AIDS in the 80s and 90s. It was an absolute death sentence at one point in time. And today, you just don't hear people dying from it. It's a manageable chronic condition. But it's a condition because you have a community where 30 or 40% of that community isn't saying, I'm not going to take AZT because I think Bill Gates has microchips in it. It's they are buying into the current evolving best science and best medical advice, which is do full mitigation, take the available therapeutics, the available medical interventions, and live your life. And and I think that is going to be the fight here, is that you now have 15 states that have either entirely or mostly dropped any requirements for mitigation. Fully crowded bars and gyms with no one wearing a mask. And you've got this ever-growing campaign against, with just nonsense crap against people getting vaccinated. And, and I think as a society, we're going to have to decide to either, live with 500,000 people dead a year indefinitely, or have some combination of, high compliance with vaccines, and or some level of mitigation. You can't have, you can't have, it's not going to go back to 2019 ever. We're going to have to manage this thing, and we can either manage it badly or we can manage it well. And I think the HIV community is a great example of what managing it well looks like. And that's largely, follow the best available scientific and medical advice, even if it changes and evolves, you keep following it, and it's completely altered that community. But I think there's also a difference between people who watched a lot of their friends die in the 80s and 90s. They're going to take it seriously. and people who are actually infected, and are experiencing the infection are going to take it seriously, and they're going to believe in things like AZT. Where I think a lot of the population here, they just simply haven't seen enough people die yet, and they haven't gotten sick enough yet. And so, it's someone else's problem and they want to go to the bar. And,
Wow.
And they're not willing to do anything to help anybody other than themselves. And that's the attitude that's going to lock us into sort of an ongoing cycle with this over the next several years if we can't find a way to break out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's also worth pointing out that the people in positions of power to make the decisions to end these sort of onerous, and I admit that they're onerous, mitigation processes, right? When I say I admit that they're onerous, my son is almost 6 weeks old and hasn't yet met my wife's grandfather, just for these safety concerns, right? So there's a real tangible emotional impact. I have an emotional investment in getting to a point where we can safely interact with people. We're not there yet, and I'm not going to risk my son's great-grandfather's life because I'm impatient. But having said that, my point was the people in positions of power to end these mitigation requirements are people who have already been vaccinated. They needed to be for matters of continuity in government and national security. So the person telling you that you don't need to be vaccinated to be safe is a person who is vaccinated and is safe. And that's an important thing to keep in the back of your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, guys. It's around 3:39. So that's 2 hours and 40 minutes of amazing information. And I know that today and in the next coming months, many people are going to revisit this. And if somebody comes back, and wants to ask questions, can I refer them to you guys? One way or another. Is there a way that people could contact you after today to ask you any pressing questions they might have about the vaccine or the virus?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. I mean, I'm on
Facebook.
I've got a newsletter that I write as well related to COVID. So, I'm out there.
Yeah. Awesome. And Jack,
same. I'm on Facebook. I don't have a Twitter. You may have learned just by listening along. I'm rather verbose and don't have thoughts that can reasonably be encaptured in 140 characters or less. But yeah, feel free to find me and send me direct messages. I'm again passionate about this stuff, so forgive me for prolonging this even more. But I did see a question about whether or not one should still get their flu shot. The answer is a resounding yes. Do get your flu shot. These are different fights, even if they're happening the same time. The series of viruses that are influenza viruses are a completely discrete set of viruses from the series of viruses known as coronaviruses. And just because we have sort of, as an artifact of the coronavirus pandemic, have adopted the types of social distancing and mitigation effects to really historically minimize the influenza disease burden, doesn't mean that influenza is going away. So yes, to the person who asked whether or not to get your flu shot, the answer is a resounding yes.
Yeah, and I personally got the influenza and pneumococcal vaccine at the end of September of this year, and then on Monday we'll have my second Pfizer vaccine for COVID. So
amazing.
I'm doing it.
Yeah, great. It's really important to get vaccinated. And I'm planning to certainly on getting vaccinated relatively soon myself as well. And I'll be getting whatever vaccines available. And right now, availability is pretty scarce, but obviously as the eligibility requirements are changing, there's more vaccines available or more slots. But so far, there's still a lot of elderly folks and people at risk who need the vaccine. So, but anyway, I'll be getting it as well as soon as the opportunity presents itself. And Dale, you've already gotten your first dose, and Jack, you'll be getting the vaccine.
I am getting my first shot actually on Thursday.
Awesome.
Good.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your expertise and your willingness to do this. Today you could easily be doing something else, Jack. You have a kid, and you decided to be here with us, and that in and of itself, I think, shows the importance of this discussion. And if there's anything else you guys would like to, leave with, maybe Dale, if you have a quick link people could write down to go visit your newsletter and stuff. And Jack, if there's anything left unsaid or if there's something you want to share as well, I'd like to give you that opportunity.
Yeah, I will just thank Dale. It may have seemed to you, Hiram, that Dale and I agreed about a lot of things, but I will stress that I learned things from Dale too.
That's amazing. Yeah, you guys have, again, I want to emphasize, you two have never met each other before this, and it almost feels like you have, through this conversation, it almost felt like, you just knew exactly, how to segue into new conversations and topics, adding to each other's knowledge and expertise.
I think we both follow the same science, so it's
yeah.
I don't think either one of us are making this stuff up. We're simply, we're the stenographers that are following what others are doing.
Well said.
Absolutely.
So my newsletter is just my name, dalewharrison.substack.com. So yes. and I was going to put it in the chat, but I can't see how I can get into the chat.
Well, no, yeah, we'll go ahead and put it out there. I'm sure one of the mods will be able to just copy and paste it into the comment section. And as this footage makes its way out to more people, we'll be sure to include that link as well, Dale, just to make sure that people can follow and keep up to date with the information. So it's already been posted, thankfully. So the link is right in the comments if any of you guys are wondering. But again, thank you so much to every single one of you guys watching, and to Jack and Dale for today's conversation. I hope that everyone has a great day, and that you continue researching, because like Dale said, this is a conversation that's happening while things are changing. The virus is constantly mutating. There are new variants and new data that we're learning every single day. And this is a conversation that's only covering what's happening today, and not necessarily covering what's going to happen in the next month. So it's just a piece of the puzzle, of a very complicated and intricate puzzle. But thank you so much, guys, and
thanks,
I hope
everybody.
you have the best day.
Okay, thanks.
And guys, thank you so much again. Dale and Jack have been incredible guests on this, platform. Jack has been with us, before in August, and he's answered many questions relating to the virus, to, how easily it spreads, how the vaccine was developed, and really, the spirit of these discussions stands firmly on the idea that most of us just need more information. I don't really believe there are many people out there that are just, by nature or, in their heart, evil or bad. And certainly, also people, aren't incompetent the way that, many people on both sides of the political spectrum call each other, right? It's always like, well, it's because you're incompetent, or it's because you don't care, or because you're dumb, or because you're evil. But really, at the end of the day, a big part of the puzzle that many are missing is the fact that we don't have so much of this information, and it's long, and it's not fun, and it's not always the most entertaining. But it's something that we all need to sit through and sort through and listen, because it is relevant to each and every one of our lives in a way that is ineffable. I couldn't explain, how directly this is impacting each and every one of us. I mean, I've had relatives pass away from COVID, upwards of 3 really close relatives of mine who, passed away from this virus. And I know there are many individuals out there that could say the same. And so, with that in mind, I want to, leave you with some food for thought, leave you with a big thank you, and really, drive home the point that this isn't about politics. This isn't about, who's dumb or, who's ignorant or who's evil or who's not evil, but more than anything and above anything else, this is about fixing the root cause of many of the issues we face, and that's a lack of information, or an overload of information that's so difficult and impossible to sort through. And the best way we can sort through this information will always be by coming together, talking to experts like Jack and Dale, and doing our best to spread the information that people like Jack and Dale share with us, by asking questions, and always being prepared to have your mind changed. But again, thank you so much. And I wish each and every one of you a beautiful day. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for always supporting this kind of work. It's always with the end of providing the community something positive and something great, to start our days and our lives on. But thank you so much, guys. I could whisper sweet nothings all day, but have a great one, and we'll see you soon.